his word. So I just want to ask him to do that. So we'll do that. We'll see what God has for us in John chapter 15. Jesus, I do pray that by your grace and your mercy, because you love us, you would meet with us through your word. I pray that you would encourage us. I pray that you would equip us, that you would convict us, that you would comfort us, that you would do your work through your word. Spirit of God, you have been sent to guide us in truth, to help us to see Jesus. And we ask that you would do that. Please, would you do it, Spirit? Help us. We want to see Jesus more clearly. We want, whether or not we realize it, the desire of our heart, big or small, is answered in Jesus. And so help us to see him. Help us to experience that. Jesus, it's in your name. It's because of you and for you that we gather. Amen. I was thinking this week, getting ready for this sermon, about a conversation that I had with a friend of mine 4 or 5 years ago. And it was after a gathering of the church. And he came up and he asked me, hey, who's your best friend? And it wasn't a question that was like, who's your best friend? You better say me. You know, it's not like, who's your... It was a genuine, thoughtful, like he cares a lot. And so he asked me this question. What he didn't know is... up until a month before that question, I would have known the answer to that question. I would have rattled it off very quickly. I would have been able to tell you, this man is my best friend. And unbeknownst to him, somewhere around a month before that, we had experienced conflict. And that friend decided to not be my friend anymore. You know, there's no way to say it other than that. That man who I would have considered my best friend no longer was. But frankly, that question around friendship is one that has always been difficult for me. Many of you know, when I was 12, at 12, I'd had a best friend for years and years and years, and he was killed. And since that moment, friendship was just it's just a difficult concept for me. It was a difficult construct. And I think all of us, like when we talk about friendship, we squirm a little bit. When you're like, okay, we're going to talk about friendship, we squirm a little bit because it reminds us, for some of us, maybe of what we had but have lost. Maybe it reminds you of what you never had but always wish that you have had. Maybe it reminds you of what you have right now and you're terrified of losing. Or maybe you're just like, no, I've given up on that. I don't need friends. Well, in this text today, Jesus is going to talk to us about friendship. And I'm trusting that he's going to do work in each of us as we hear his heart for friendship, as we hear what Jesus thinks about friendship. Now, to remind us, we are in the middle of this last evening that Jesus has with his followers, with his closest followers. This is Thursday evening. On Thursday evening, a little later in this evening, he's going to be betrayed by his friend. He is going to be sold, he's going to be given into the hands of the Romans, and on Friday morning, he's going to be put to death. And he has this last evening with his friends that he loves dearly. And last week, we saw him talk about the vine and the branches, that he's the vine and that we're the branches. He calls us to remain in him, and we saw that Jesus really wants union with you. He wants a relationship with you, and he desires for you to be fruitful, and that comes in and through you remaining in his love and in his word. Jesus told us in verse 9 of John 15 that he loves us just like the Father has loved him, and that he wants true joy in our life. Like he wants joy, and that only comes in and through him, in and through remaining in his word, abiding in his word, making our home in him. And so here's where we're headed this morning. I want you to see 3 things about friendship from just these short few verses, verse 12 through 17. 3 things about friendship. First, Jesus wants you as a friend. He wants you as a friend. Look at verse 12 of John 15. This is my command, Jesus says. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Verse 15, I do not call you servants anymore, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I've made known to you everything I've heard from my Father. So I want to ask a question, and I don't want you to answer it too quickly. I just want you to consider it. When you hear that statement, Jesus wants you as a friend, or when you see it up there, how comfortable are you with that concept? What does it make you feel? What does it make you think? Maybe what do you feel in your body as you think through that? Because there's some of you who are like, yes, man, I'm here because Jesus wants me as his friend. Jesus has made me his friend. I have this close relationship with Jesus that I'm utterly dependent on. Some of you are uncomfortable with that statement, and you know exactly why. You're like, if you handed me the mic, I could tell you exactly why I'm uncomfortable with that. Some of you are uncomfortable with it, and you're like, I don't know why I'm uncomfortable. It just doesn't feel right. We have this tendency to experience a polarization between what theologians have called the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. That God is transcendent, he is holy, he is other than, he exists beyond our ability to comprehend all that he is, and he also is immanent. He's close, he's near, he's a friend that sticks closer than a brother. That God is both other than, holy, righteous, perfect, and he's also close, he's near to us, he's close at hand. And so some of you, when you hear Jesus wants to be my friend, your friend, it feels too close. It just feels too like, I don't think I'm supposed to be that familiar with Jesus. That does not feel reverent to me. You probably would tend to, like a lot of others, to the transcendence of God, the holiness of God, the otherness of God. Then there are some of you who hear that and you're like, totally, Jesus is my homeboy. Like, well, Jesus doesn't say, hey, I am your homeboy. He says, I've called you friends. It's not the type of relationship where like, yeah, man, that person's my boy. He never disagrees with me. He's always like thinks I'm awesome and agrees with it. He would never disagree with me. He would never tell me, hey, what you're doing is wrong. Hey, what I see in your life, it's wrong, because that's not what homeboys do. Homeboys are just like, yeah, forget them. Forget that you're right in everything. So for you, it's like, it doesn't feel awkward at all, and it should be. When Jesus calls us friends, it should jar both extremes. Like, wait a second, that's too familiar. Or wait a second, do I really deserve this? You know, what's interesting is reading commentaries, which are really, really helpful. This is academics and theologians who dive into the languages and dive into what's going on in the text and kind of how it's historically been interpreted. Very, very helpful. What was interesting to me about this text is so many of them focus on what we're supposed to do. Like, this is how we're supposed to be friends to one another, just like Jesus was a friend. That's what we're supposed to do, but the focus is entirely on what we're supposed to do. And I think the reason is it would be way more comfortable for me in this sermon to focus on, here are all the things that Jesus is like, be a better friend to one another. And it's a little bit more uncomfortable for me to just sit in the reality that Jesus is a good friend to me and that Jesus actually desires friendship with me. That's a little more difficult. In some ways, I want the Jesus who just gives me a list of what I'm supposed to be doing and not the one who just sits you down and says, hey, I want to be your friend. I want you as my friend. And that's a big deal. I think it gets assumed a lot of times. Yeah, Jesus is saying he's my friend and I'm supposed to love others just like Jesus has loved me. But I think we would do well to just pause and say, Jesus wants to be your friend. Now, here's an implication of that. For Jesus to want to be your friend implies that you need friends. It implies that you need friends. It's not Jesus saying, hey, to those of you who feel lonely, to those of you who are the type of people that need people in their life, I want to be your friend. But to those of you who are like, nah, I'm good, I can do it on my own. I made it this far on my own. I don't need people. Jesus is like, well, good on you. I'm here for the other people that do. No, the implication is you need friends. Have you ever thought about this? In the Garden of Eden, when God creates Adam, He's creating everything. He's creating sun, stars, moon, land, animals, plants, fishes, all that. And every time he creates, it's like, man, it's good. It's good, it's good. And then he creates Adam. He's like, oh, it's very good. And then for the first time, God says that something is not good. In Genesis 2, verse 18, God says it's not good for the man to be alone. Here's the thought. Have you thought about the fact that Adam was lonely because he was perfect, not because he wasn't perfect? Like, this is before the fall. This is before sin fractures everything. Adam was lonely. There is holiness and righteousness in loneliness. He was lonely because he was perfect. And there wasn't a helper found suitable for him. Here's a thought I want to offer to you. Loneliness is actually a gift from God given to each of us as a reflection of what we were created for. That we were created for deep, meaningful relationship with God and with others. And loneliness is actually an expression that God has given us to give voice to how we were created. I read a pastor this week, this is a jarring statement, who said, the less you need friends, the less you are like God. And that's just one of those, like, I first read it and I was like, no, I don't like that. And it was like, okay, wait, why don't I like that? And I think the point he's trying to make is God didn't create us because he's like, man, I'm creating sun, stars. And he's like, man, I'm super lonely and I need some people around me so that I won't be lonely. Love expresses itself. And in an expression of the love that God has always existed in, God the Father, Son, Spirit, in perfect relationship with one another, 3 persons, one God. How does that all work? 2,000 years of church history. We're still like, how does that work? God is infinite. We are finite. And the expectation that I would be able to fully understand all that's wrapped up in an infinite God with my finite brain is actually quite arrogant. So I'm comfortable with just saying, there's one God, 3 persons. He's existed in perfect relationship. And not because he was lonely, but because in that relationship, it was full of love. In an expression of that love, he creates us to experience relationship with him and others in the same way that he was experiencing relationships. The implication is you need friends. Love is meant to be expressed and to be shared. And so Jesus wants you as a friend. But it gets better than that. Not only does Jesus want you as a friend, Jesus chooses you as a friend. He chooses you as a friend. Look at the beginning of verse 16. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And it's not, again, I think there's the potential for us viewing Jesus choosing us and saying, hey, I want you as a friend, to view Jesus like he's the last one picked on the dodgeball field, you know? He's out there and like, I want you. And Jesus is like, I just want some friends. I'm lonely. That's not it. Jesus is like, I want people to experience what I experience, and as an overflow of my love, I want to invite other people into relationship with the Godhead, with the Trinity, and with each other in a redeemed way. And so he says, hey, you did not choose me, but I chose you. Just so that his followers, and so that we wouldn't be like, wow, Jesus wants me as my friend. There must be something pretty special about me. Jesus is like, hey, I chose you because I love you. I mean, this is Deuteronomy 7. I actually looked it up. I mentioned this in the 9. So if you were in the 9, I apologize. Because I was like, Deuteronomy 31 or 32. Definitely not that. Deuteronomy 7. It's close. God tells the people of Israel, God tells them through Moses, the Lord has set his heart on you and chose you, not because you are more numerous than all the peoples, for you are the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you. I'm like, man, Jesus wants you as his friend, and he chooses you as his friend. Why? It's not meant to produce arrogance in us. It's meant to produce humility in us. And Jesus would say, because I love you. Because I love you. He chooses you as friend. Now, you may be thinking like, I'm not sure I want Jesus as friend. And maybe you would say like, my life's been a mess. Like, what kind of friend really is Jesus? Well, he tells us in verse 13, the New Living Translation, he says there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And Jesus is actually going to give expression to that in just a few hours. He's saying there's no greater love than one lays down his life for his friends, and then he goes and does that. When Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life, no man comes to the Father except through me. When Jesus says, hey, I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to prepare a place for you. What he's actually talking about is what he's going to accomplish on Friday. When he hangs on the cross, suffering the punishment of God in our place and says, it's finished, that's what he's talking about. I'm laying down my life to bring you into a family that you and I don't deserve to be in. And we're made sons and daughters of God and friends with Jesus. He's the type of friend who does not bail on his friends. You know, like the guys he's having this conversation with, in just a few hours, we're like, yeah, Jesus, you're great. We're your friends. We're going to be with you to the end. In just a few hours, they're going to deny that they even know Jesus. They're all going to bail on Jesus. And I think like our concept of friendship often would be Jesus be like, you're not with me, I'm not with you. I'm finding new friends. But Jesus doesn't do that. He still goes to the cross. He goes to the cross alone. It's because Jesus never bails on his friends. He'll never leave you or forsake you, Scripture says. He is with you to the end. He wants you as a friend. He chooses you as his friend. Third, it gets even better than that. He invites you into his mission. He wants you as a friend. He chooses you as a friend, and he invites you into his mission. Look at verse 16 of John 15. You did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce fruit, and that your fruit should remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. He actually invites us into his mission. When I got out of the military, something happened that I was not ready for. I can't even, some of you are very familiar with this. You know what I'm talking about. I had this like, who am I identity crisis that it took me years to actually give language to, like, what am I experiencing? And through the help of some counselors and friends, I realized when I left the military, I lost brotherhood and mission. There was this unique brotherhood among those of us who had experienced combat together that was gone when I got out of the military. And there was just a clear mission that we were a part of, and both were gone. And it was just this like, it really was this kind of earth-shattering thing. And I was like, who am I and what am I? And what I love is during that season, Jesus helped me to see that he actually invites me into an even deeper brotherhood, a family, the family of God. And he invites me into his mission. 2 Corinthians 5 says that we've been reconciled to God. Those who were enemies of God have been brought close to God to be reconcilers. We've been given the ministry of reconciliation. And then that text says we are ambassadors for Christ. This is what Jesus means by he wants to produce fruit in us, invite us into his mission. We're ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you be reconciled to God. Now, here's what that meant. Here's what people who heard that during that time would have thought of when Paul says we are ambassadors for Christ. An ambassador during this time is not like the ambassadors we have right now. During this time, an ambassador would go out ahead of conquering kings to the lands and the people that the king was about to conquer. And an ambassador would say, the king is coming, he's going to conquer this land, but he offers terms of peace. If you will lay down your arms and join the king, you can be brought into the kingdom as servants. And that's what an ambassador would do. He would go out in front of the king. So when Jesus brings us into his family, he brings us into friendship with us, with him, and then says, I've appointed you to go and produce fruit. He's saying we are ambassadors. That's Paul helps us understand what's going on there. We go in front of the king. I mean, have you thought of this? Revelation makes clear that Jesus is coming back a second time, unlike he did the first time. The second time he comes back, he is coming back as a conquering king. And he has actually left us here in some ways behind enemy lines, where there's news of a king who has come and who will come again, but that kingdom is not fully experienced by us and by the world. And as his ambassadors, we go out into the world saying, the king is coming, but the king offers peace. Yet it's utterly different than ambassadors during this time. It gets even better, because ambassadors during this time would have gone out in front of Caesar and said, Caesar is coming into these lands. His armies are coming. This land is now Caesar's. Caesar is offering peace. This is where the term Pax Romana comes from, the peace of Rome. Now, ironically, the period of Pax Romana was not actually a time of peace experienced by a lot of people. It was a time when Rome came in and said, do you want to fight or do you want to lay down your arms? You want to fight? Okay, we'll fight. You're going to lay down your arms. We're taking this land either way. That's what Rome would do. Here's what we do, though. This is so crazy. We go out in front of the king and say, the king offers peace, but not as servants, as sons and daughters of the king. Like the king is saying, I'm offering terms of peace, and I'm actually inviting you to be a part of my family. And Jesus says, I haven't called you servants, I've called you friends. Like no one would have gone in front of Caesar and said, Caesar's coming into this land, and he wants to adopt you into the family as Caesar and make you an heir of Caesar. That's crazy, but that's what we do. We're saying the king is coming. The true king is coming. And the true king loves you. And the true king has given his life to suffer what you were meant to suffer. And he actually offers adoption into his family, friendship with the true king. He invites us into his mission. Okay, Jesus wants you as friend. He chooses you as friend. He invites you into his mission. How should you respond? I mean, that's good news. It should be good. It's the best news. And we should ask, okay, how now should I respond? Two thoughts. You should respond first with love for Jesus. You should respond with love for Jesus. Verse 14 of John 15. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants anymore because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. I have called you friends because I have made known to you everything I've heard from my Father. So in this last conversation Jesus has with his followers before he goes to the cross, he says a number of times, if you love me, you will obey me, or something along those lines. So he says it there in verse 14, you're my friends if you do what I command you. Verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commands. Verse 21 of John 14, the one who has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. Verse 23 of John 14, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. Verse 10 of John 15, if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. So here's what's clear, because it would be easy to look at John 15, verse 14, saying all these numbers together. I'm getting them crossed in my head. Hopefully they've been clear. Verse 14 of John 15, him saying, you are my friends if you do what I command you, could make us possibly think, okay, to be Jesus' friend, for him to choose to want to be my friend, I have to do what he commands. But that's not what actually what he says. That's why we got to look at the other things that he says in chapters 14 and 15. Because what Jesus is saying is, if you love me, it will be visible. So like, if you love me, it will be evidenced in your life. It's clear that he's saying, you will show yourselves to be my friends by following my way and my words. That's what he's saying. You'll show yourself to be my friends by obeying me. And here's what's crazy. He says we do that not as servants, but as friends. When he says in verses 14 and 15, I don't call you servants anymore because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. Like a servant's response to a master would have been, hey, I'm telling you as your master, do this, just do it. But Jesus says, I've called you friends and I've made clear to you everything that I've heard from my Father. Jesus is saying like, hey, follow my words and my way because I've made clear to you this is God's plan of salvation. This is what God is doing in the world. This is what he's inviting you into. This is the way to true restoration. At the end of last week, this is the way to true joy. He's not just saying, do these things. He's saying, do these things because this is what God is doing in the world. That's how you relate to friends. And what he's trying to make so clear is, if you love me, it will be expressed by saying, Jesus, I want to, with your help, by the power of your Spirit, I want to follow your words and your way. And I think we settle too much with, like, maybe we wouldn't say this, but with essentially living like, Jesus, I love you. I just don't care much what you have to say. I trust better what I have to say. I trust better what these TikTok videos or Instagram reels, I like what they have to say better, Jesus. I think their way makes more sense. Like, we've got to say, like, okay, here's a thought. If I were to tell my beautiful wife, Kristen, I love you, I just don't much care what you have to say. Like, how love is not a verb, but love is expressed by verbs. That makes sense. Love is a verb. Looks great on a t-shirt, looks good on a cup. Like, that's not actually how Scripture talks about love. But it is expressed by verbs. It's expressed through actions. So my love for Kristen is not equal to the actions. My love for Kristen is expressed by how I listen to her, receive her, cherish her, serve her. And it would be crazy. Like some of you guys, some of you seasoned saints in here, if you were to hear me say to my wife, I love you, I just don't care much about what you say, you would be like, young buck. You can't say that. You can't do that. Not going to go so well. You'd be like, hey, I got a real comfortable couch that you can use tonight because you won't be sleeping in your bed. But like, how often do we live lives that say like, Jesus, I love you, but I just don't much care about what you have to say? Jesus challenges all of us to say, hey, you say you love me. Is it expressed by you? Again, man, we do it imperfectly. But with the help of the Spirit, saying, Jesus, I want to follow your way and your words. We respond to the grace and to the love that Jesus has for us with love for him, expressed by saying, Jesus, I want to follow your way and your word. Second, we respond by loving others like Jesus has loved us. By loving others like Jesus has loved us. Look at verse 12 and 13 again. Jesus says, this is my command. It says, like, again, you love me, follow my way and my word. This is my word. Love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. And the end of verse 17, the end of our verses today. This is what I command you, love one another. And so it would do us well, like intentionally, we have spent the bulk of today talking about Jesus' desire to be our friends and how Jesus is a friend. Because like what we're tempted to do is like, yeah, okay, Jesus, just tell me what to do. But we've got to understand, like, we can only love one another insofar as we're actually experiencing Jesus' love for us. Your love for one another, driven just by your motivation to love one another, will not last. If all you're praying for is, Jesus, I just want the motivation to be able to love other people, there is going to come a time where you're like, I don't want to. My motivation is gone. What we actually need is, Jesus, I want to experience your love and your friendship. And the experience of that, I want to lead to a response of loving you and loving other people, because I can't do it without your help. So, how are we to love one another? Just a few things, a few ways as we close. First, we don't bail on one another. We don't bail on one another. One of the ways that the Hebrew language is much more expressive language than ours. And so for the concept of love, they had a number of different ways to describe it. And one of those ways is what's called ahava. Ahava. And the best way to understand that is ahava, love, is a love of will, of resoluteness. It's saying, I have seen the worst of you, and I'm still right here. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. It's a love that is, like, emotions are important, but it's a love that endures whether or not the emotion of quote-unquote love is there. It's the one that says, no, I'm here. And this is how Jesus loves us. Because Lord knows, how many times have we bailed on Jesus? Like, we could not endure one iota of what he has endured for us. And when Jesus says, love each other like I've loved you, it compels us to say, yes, love me. Like, this is not saying, this is another sermon for another day to say, like, yes, there's wisdom in boundaries and people who have caused you harm. And so I'm not talking about like it is a boundary-free thing and you just continue to let people hurt you. That's not another sermon for another day. It's saying we don't bail on one another. We're saying, no, Jesus doesn't bail on me. I'm not bailing on you. Second, we don't demand from one another. We don't demand from one another. One of the ways that love often gets talked about is like, hey, it's a transactional thing. It's like, love somebody else the way that they receive love so that you will receive love in return. And that's just not how Jesus loves us. I'm going to put a book on blast right now, and I know it's been so helpful for a lot of people, so I just apologize in advance. There's this book called The 5 Love Languages. And it's like, hey, how do you receive love from other people? And I'm not saying that's wrong. I think if you engage something like that, like, man, I love my spouse, or I love my kids, I love these people, and I just want to know how to show that in a way that they can receive. Great, that can be helpful. But the way I often hear that book talked about is this transactional thing, which is like, hey, if you want your spouse to love you like this, you love them like this. And that's not at all how Christ loves us. Jesus does not love us in a way that says, okay, I'm going to love you like this, and my demand is you need to respond to that love in kind, or else you don't get my love anymore. But that's how we respond to each other all the time. It's like, well, I've been loving you like this, and you haven't responded to that love. So I don't know. Until you meet me halfway, I'm not loving you anymore. No, we don't demand from one another. Jesus says, hey, greater love has no one than this, than he lays down his life for his friends. And that's not just in big, massive ways. Because there's so many who are like, yeah, man, I'd take a bullet for anybody in this church. Like, I would do that, man. I'd jump in front of a train for all you guys. It's not just the big acts of love, but it's in the day-to-day. Like, am I willing to love even when the response to that love isn't what I hope for? That's how Jesus loves. We don't demand for one another. Third, we don't demand others to be Jesus for us. We don't demand others to be Jesus for us. Here's what I mean. Our tendency in relationships is to place massive weight on the shoulders of other people and almost no weight on the shoulders of Jesus. I'm going to explain this. We're going to flesh this out a little bit. I have a friend who told me conflict happens in relationships when you expect too little of Jesus and too much of other people. Here's what I mean by that. If you try to get other people to fulfill a loneliness in you that only Jesus can fill, you'll put a weight on their shoulders that they were never meant to bear, and it wreaks havoc in relationships. And what I mean by that is if you have, be it friend, spouse, whatever it is, if you have somebody that you're like, I am depending on you to never let me down, to always be there for me, to always know exactly what I'm thinking, what I need, all of that, you are placing the weight. Only Jesus can be that. Only Jesus knows what I'm thinking all the time, what I need all the time. Only Jesus will always be there for me. Only Jesus will never let me down. And what I tend to do relationally is what we all tend to do relationally is put that expectation off of the shoulders of Jesus and onto someone else. Jesus' shoulders are really big. He can handle that. Jesus, I need you to never let me down. I need you to never abandon me. You promise you won't do that. What we tend to do is expect others to be Jesus for us, and it breaks relationships. However, if you put the right weight on Jesus, you say, Jesus, I'm putting significant relational weight on you as my friend. It takes pressure off of other relationships. It enables you to celebrate and to be grateful rather than to always demand something different than what you're experiencing relationally. So what I mean is like, when friendship with Jesus is good with me, when I'm like, man, Jesus is a friend that sticks closer than a brother. Jesus is the one who's always going to be there. Jesus is the one who can endure the weight of my relational expectations. It frees me to be a good friend and to experience good friendship. But when I take the weight that only Jesus was meant to bear and say, I need you to be this, to do this, essentially like I need you to be perfect for me, it puts a crushing weight on other people where they have to either lie and pretend that there's something they're not or face the reality of constantly letting you down. However, when you can say, hey, friend, I love you. I don't need you to be Jesus for me. It frees you up to experience incredible relational connection with people. Hey, and I was having a conversation with a friend here in between gatherings, and we were talking about the fact that there's coming a day where we will not have to maintain relationships anymore. You know that when Jesus comes back, relationships won't be work. We won't have to apologize for letting one another down. We won't have to tell one another hey, man, you hurt me in this moment. We won't have to do that because everything's going to be perfect. And what we get to do is say, hey, friend, to one another, let's experience a bit of that reality right now and commit to one another that when we fail each other, when we let each other down, that we're not going to be surprised by that and we're going to move towards one another in the midst of that. That's what Jesus frees us to do. This is Paul. I love, 2 Timothy 4 is the last letter Paul writes before he is put to death for Jesus. And in 2 Timothy 4, if you've never really read it in depth or read it thinking about what would it be for me to experience someone like Paul saying things like this, it's a super dark letter. Super dark. And incredibly hopeful. He just vacillates between these tensions in a really beautiful way. He says at one point, at my first offense, no one stood by me, everyone abandoned me. And he says something that I think if we were sitting with Paul in missional community, and he was like, man, at my first offense, no one was with me. You'd probably be like, Paul, I don't know that hyperbole is helpful right now. Really, nobody was with you? But what he goes on to say is, nobody was with me, everyone abandoned me, may it not be held against them. And I think he can come to that perspective. Man, the people I wanted with me, they weren't there. May it not be held against them. And he says right after that, verse 17, I believe it is, 2 Timothy 4, but Jesus stood by me and strengthened me. And then what he does at the end of his letter, it's incredible. He goes from no one was with me, everyone abandoned me, Jesus was with me, strengthened me. At the end of 2 Timothy 4, he just gushes about all his friends. He's like, oh man, this person and this person and this person. So he doesn't end up at the end of his life somebody who's like, Jesus is the only friend I need. I don't need anybody else. Everybody else will just let you down. He experiences real, deep relationship with Jesus. It enables him to endure relational pain from other people and to not give up on friendship at the end of his life. Where he just ends his life, not like a crotchety, crusty old man who's like, well, I don't want to let anybody too close. He ends his life by oh man, I love this person and this person. They're so valuable to me in ministry. It's this incredible thing. That's what friendship with Jesus enables us to do. The ache for friendship was actually put in your heart by Jesus, and it can only be fully and completely fulfilled by Jesus. And experiencing with Jesus will enable you to both receive and to give true friendship to others. Okay, fourth, finally, how do we love one another? Fourth and finally, we encourage one another. This is what Jesus is doing all throughout this last conversation he has with his friends. He knows that he's going to go to the cross. They're going to feel alone. He's like, man, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I'm going to come to you. He tells them, I'm going to send the helper. If I don't go, the helper won't come. Oh, man, I'm for it. He's encouraging them. One of the ways that we encourage one another is by sharing our lives and our stories together. C.S. Lewis has this great book, The Four Loves. And in that book, he has this famous quote where he says, friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, what? You too? I thought I was the only one. When in vulnerability, we're able to receive something someone else says and not immediately make it about ourselves. Not immediately like, oh yeah, let me just talk about what I want to talk about. But to actually say, oh, you thought you were a failure as a mother? I feel that too. You thought you were a terrible provider? I thought that too. You feel like God has given up on you? Man, I thought I was the only one that felt that. You feel like the black sheep of the family? I thought I was the only one who felt that. That's what he's saying. When in vulnerability, we can look at another person and say, I thought I was the only one who experienced that. Friendship is born in that moment. Hearts get knit together in that moment. Hey, let's stand together. I want to invite those who are serving communion to come down front. All that we are talking about. how we respond to Jesus' love and we love one another, it's all a response to and a reflection of Jesus' love for us, his friends. Jesus says in verse 13, greater love has no man than this. Then he lays down his life for his friends. And then Jesus goes to the cross and does just that. And think about this. On this evening when he experiences, he both shares with them what he's about to do, and he knows that he's about to be betrayed by them. He gives this meal to them that we're about to celebrate. Like this meal that we celebrate every week. It's the same one that Jesus had with his followers then. These ones who are about to abandon him, to run away from him as a friend. And he says, hey, every time you gather together, I want you to remember what I've done, what it costs to bring you into the family of God. So he takes a piece of bread, says, I want you to remember that my body was torn apart for you. That friendship with Jesus costs something. Adoption into the family of God actually costs something, and it was Jesus being willing to endure the punishment from God that you and I deserve for our rebellion against God. And then he raises a cup, says, as often as you drink this, I want you to remember my blood that was poured out, the blood of the new covenant, which paves the way, which brings us into relationship with God. And so we lift the wine or the juice, depending on our convictions, and remember Jesus Christ crucified for us. In this meal, in a mysterious way, it's not just a meal of remembrance, but it's also a meal of presence. Jesus is present with us in a spiritual way as we come to the table. So maybe for you, and I want you all in some way to focus on friendship with Jesus. And maybe you come with a whole bunch of faith to receive the bread and the wine and remember, man, my friend laid down his life for me. That's the kind of friend he is. Or maybe you come and you say, Jesus, I'm not experiencing the reality of friendship with you. So would you meet with me as I come to your table? Would you help me to experience that, Jesus? If you wouldn't consider yourself a follower of Jesus, I want to ask you to do two things. Would you honor us by not taking this meal? It's a faith meal, a meal of faith. And if you don't have faith, it doesn't mean anything. It could potentially be harmful for you to take this meal. But secondly, I do want to ask you to participate in this meal. And the way I want to encourage you to do that is just by saying, could this be true? Could it be that the God-man Jesus loves me so much and wants me as his friend so much that he really would endure what I deserve? We're going to scroll a couple prayers on screen as we come to the table. And one is a prayer of doubt. One's one where you say,